let's look at this text together. So, we have different translations, which is good. Genesis chapter 22. How does the story begin? Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, wait a minute. Doesn't somebody somewhere say, don't lead us to the test? Or doesn't somebody else say God doesn't test anybody? So we have something happening here, don't we? God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. Go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. Where's the objection? Where's the objection? That's the first thing to notice. Why is there no objection? That would be one way to look at it. But why? Why is he obedient? Let's keep going. And to whom is he obedient? Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac. Back up. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up, saw the place in the distance, said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship. Notice this, we will worship, and we will come back to you. That's the verse that the writer to the Hebrews is going to riff on. Now go all the way to the end of the story down to verse 19. What do you read in verse 19? Where's Isaac? Where is Isaac? He said, we will return. And then Abraham alone returns. Where's Isaac? Are you with me? The rabbis, when they were looking at this text, they couldn't sort out where, when I say the rabbis, I'm referring to the 2nd through the 5th century post-Christian era rabbis, 200s to 500. They said, well, there's no mention of Isaac, so he stayed behind. But Abraham didn't sacrifice him, so why did he stay behind? Oh, Abraham built a yeshiva, a rabbinic school, so Isaac could attend school there. That's what they said. Because they wanted him to be a trained rabbi like they were, so they make him out to go to school there. But the text is interesting, is it not? Now we move on through the text. We'll keep reading. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up, said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son. Abraham replied, hear all this language, the son whom you love? Father, son, father, son. What's all this language so reminiscent of? The gospel. Why then don't the gospel writers use this text? Why does Jesus never say, this is how it's going to be for me? Why does Paul never use this text? Or the writer to the Hebrews ever use this text with reference to the death of Jesus? Why don't they do that? Watch. Fire in the wood are here. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? I mean, this kid's pretty aware, isn't he? He knows how the ritual goes. He knows what they're going up there to do. Where's the lamb? When they reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar there. Who builds the altar? Where's Isaac? He's his son. Why doesn't he help him build the altar? Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood on it, bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to cut his son's throat. That's about as bad as it gets. Pretty dark. But, and this is always the but, the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abram, Abram, here I am, he replied, don't lay a hand on the boy. Don't do anything. Now I know you fear God. You've not withheld your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns, went over, took the ram, and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Now, what theme do you see developing here that we've been seeing develop in the New Testament? Yes, of animal for human. This text represents a shift from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. In other words, there's still sacrifice, but now the outlet is not human against human. It's going to be transferred to human against animal. The animal becomes the surrogate. Keep going. So Abraham, verse 14, called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day, it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. These narrator comments are so funny. The angel of the Lord called Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, make your descendants, pop, 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 pop. And then, of course, Abraham returns alone. God tested Abraham. Did God test Abraham? What's the text doing? What's it doing? So here's a clue. You'll notice that you have the word God and you have the phrase angel of the Lord. God in the text is the generic ancient Semitic name El. This are the consonants YHWH. It is commonplace in Abraham's culture to sacrifice the firstborn son, the male that opens the womb. That's how we do it. It's how we Now, you have this common theme of sacrificing the firstborn son. You'll notice that God always picks the secondborn son. Isaac, not Ishmael. Jacob, not Esau. Joseph, not his brothers. Secondborn. So you have this firstborn is got to be killed, and the gods are saying, okay, this is how we do religion. Sacrifice your son. Abraham hears the voice of this God. He goes and he just does what he's supposed to do. But it is this revelatory God, this covenant God that's going, stop. I'm not that kind of a God. I don't like human blood. I can't teach you right now that I'm nonviolent, you need to be nonviolent, and the people that are going to follow you will be nonviolent, because you won't get that, because you need a God that is going to be big and powerful and mighty and dominate. I can't teach you all that yet, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I'm different than the other gods. I don't accept human sacrifice. Here's your substitution. And now you have, of course, in this Genesis text, a justification in Torah for the religious sacrificial system. But you also have in this text a shift, a big shift, several shifts. One away from human to animal sacrifice, another from a generic God to a very specific revelatory God. I mean, it's all here, isn't it? So why don't the New Testament writers use this? And exactly. And what do the evangelicals say? God required the death of Jesus. Everything that the evangelicals say about the death of Jesus is a bald-faced lie and absolutely the opposite of the gospel. They just are simply preaching archaic religious practices of 5,000 years old. The evangelical message is a 5,000, 7,000, 10,000-year-old bad news message of a bad news God. The biblical text is moving us, it's shifting us away from that. I've shown you this in Philippians, the Colossians hymn, Hebrews 1. We'll do it again in John 1 in a minute. Here it is in Genesis 2, the shift. You want to see another interesting text? Again, I've referred to it. Look at Jeremiah chapter 7. It's the text that Jesus quotes when he's in the temple. Jeremiah is a trenchant critic of the Jewish temple system, so much so that he's banished for 20 years. But in Jeremiah chapter 7, I would like someone, what translation do you have, Will? Oh, good. And what translation do you have? NIV. We all have NIV. Now, here's what I'd like you to do. Please read for me verses 21. No, okay, well, first let's do this. Let's read the NIV in verses 21, 22, and 23. So go ahead and take a moment and look at them. 21, 22, and 23, chapter 7. Just take a look at this text for a minute. What's the text say? Okay, but what does it say about these burnt offerings? I mean, and very carefully, who commanded the burnt offerings in this text? In the text you're reading, who commanded the burnt offerings? It does. So keep reading. I did not just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices. Who commanded the burnt offerings and sacrifices according to this text? God did. I gave them other commands. I told them just walk in my way, but I also gave them the commands about sacrifices. Right? What if I were to tell you that that little word just is not in the Hebrew or the Greek at all? The translators have thrown that word in there. Now, read the sentence out loud and take the word just out. Woo, that's about as clear as you can get. I did not write Leviticus. Right? The translators are evangelical. They refuse to believe that God did not dictate Leviticus. And so they have to literally make Jeremiah fit their thinking. And the way they do that is to put the little word just into that translation. This is why I don't trust translations. The regular person that doesn't know Hebrew or Greek is at the absolute mercy of the theology of the translators. Right? It's the same thing in 2 Corinthians 5:21, which we would normally take to be, he who knew no sin, God made sin on our behalf that we might become the righteousness of God in him. God made Jesus sin. The word God is not in the text. It's the one who knew no sin was found to be sin. Who determined Jesus was a sinner in the Passion narrative? Who decided Jesus was a sinner? The people, Caiaphas, the leadership, right? Roman authorities, whatever. Nowhere in the Passion narrative does it say God decided Jesus was a sinner. If God comes into the Passion narrative on the side of the persecutors, yes, kill him. I'm with you. He deserves to die. I need my anger assuaged. I'm with you, Pilate. I'm with you, Caiaphas. Let's kill the son of a bitch. If that's the side that God takes, he's not on the cross reconciling the world to himself. He's on the outside beating the shit out of his son because of sin. But that's not the gospel. It just is not the gospel. We move past this logic that requires blood and sacrifice in the New Testament. It is a total reversal. It is anti-religion. The gospel is anti-religion. And that's why modern Christianity isn't living the life of Jesus. You look at modern Christians, you look at the church, you got churches on every corner and everybody and their brother's got a call from the Lord. Every last one of these churches in Vegas, I guarantee you with a few exceptions, might be the Methodists, I don't know, every last church in Vegas you can go to is going to be a sacrificial church. And it doesn't matter whether it's Lutheran, Episcopal, Methodist, Charismatic Baptist, you name the group, it really doesn't matter. There are 41,000 different types of denominational organizations registered with the Internal Revenue Service in the United States as not-for-profit churches, and every damn one of them claims to have the truth from the pulpit. 41,000 interpretations at a denominational level, and that doesn't include all the little independent churches that do their own thing, of which you're probably looking at 400,000. Now, let me ask you this. You have 400,000 people all claiming to speak the truth, but they're all speaking the truth this way. And they're all fighting with each other, trying to parse this out. The gospel's not here. The gospel is over here in non-sacrificial thinking and living. And this is not Christendom. This is folks. This is groups, small groups. This is couples. This is not institutional. It's non-sacrificial living. In other words, I don't require anybody to pay for me or pay for my sins. I don't require, if you've sinned against me, that you owe me. I don't require that. I live non-sacrificially. I let it go. I forgive. Boom. This is gun culture, isn't it? You betcha. I got all kinds of stuff to defend. I got my house. I got my wife and children. I got my car and boat. I got my IRA and 401k. I got all the... See the grasping? If you're grasping, of course you're going to defend. But if you're letting go, there's nothing to defend. One of the best things about the metaphor of the cross is when your wrists are nailed to a cross, you can't take anything. Your hands are empty and they stay empty until you die. That's just how it is. Okay, you with me on this? All these churches are still in this sacrificial model. They're reading the Bible through the lens that God requires sacrifice. Every one of them. I mean, we could go around tomorrow, and instead of going to church, we could go attend all these churches tomorrow, and we'd hear the same thing, variations on a theme, all claiming to be the true truth against the other guys, but all of them really saying the same thing. This is the problem of religion. Okay. Now, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is not used by the New Testament writers the way in it's the form it's in, because the text says God required the death of Isaac, but it's the angel of Hashem, the Lord, that shifts things. They can't use that text because it uses the word God, but they can show the shift in what they do. That very shift is precisely what's happening in Hebrews, the Gospel of John, Luke, Paul. That shift is happening. But they can't use this text because the Father never requires the death of the Son. Okay? You with me? Okay. Otherwise, it would be the perfect text. Okay, how are we doing on time? We near lunch or? Okay, all right. Be really, really, really careful with your translations. Always use an RSV or an NRSV, the Revised Standard Version or New Revised Standard Version, as a check. Those translators were more liberal, and so they weren't quite as hamstrung as the conservatives that did the NIV. But even then, the RSV writers are still evangelicals, and so they're going to put things in. So, for example, in Paul's letter to the Romans, Paul uses the term he orge, the wrath. And for Paul, the wrath is the breakdown of human culture into chaos. That's the wrath. The coming wrath is when the shit hits the fan. So in America, we have the wrath coming. It's not the wrath of God. It's the seeds that we have sown. We're the world's biggest weapons exporter. We are a gun culture. I mean, you sow what you reap. And we're about to. And we now know what it's like to have someone as the head of our government that is just about everything that we don't see in Jesus. You know what I mean? And it's a sign of the breakdown of American culture. It's just the fact is, friends, we're on our way out as the top dog. We're on our way out as a republic. It will happen in our lifetimes, just as it happened to Germany in World War II, Japan in World War II, Britain, Spain, all the great empires. They fall. Some fall permanently, but in the modern world, most just end up taking another place in the ranking. It's going to happen to us, and we are going to have a season in this country of some serious, serious stuff, and people will die. It's just going to happen. The wrath is coming. Our cultural crisis, our breakdown is coming. And when Paul uses the term the wrath, that's what he's referring to. But you know what the translators do? They can't sort this out And so they go, oh, and in your English text, it's the wrath of. That's right. Now, I want to show you something, and you would already know this from Campbell. I don't know if Jay knows this. And Charlotte? Charlene. C-H-A-R. Got it. So I don't know if you know this, but I want to show you something fun. Turn to Romans chapter 1. Let's have some fun. Let's see how sick the Apostle Paul is. That's right. We're looking at Romans 1. Now, Romans 1 is a clobber text. That's what it's known as in the LGBT community, because it's the text that you use to say, okay, you faggots are all going to burn in hell because you're all perverts. And that's how the evangelicals will read a text like this. I'm about to show you another way to read this text that will blow your minds. You ready? Watch this. So, Romans 1:16, after Paul has done the introduction to his letter, and I prayed for you and I've done this, and here's the reason I want to come. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a rectification, a right-wising, making right from God is revealed. A making right that is by trust from first to last, beginning to end, just as it is written, the righteous will live by trust. Now the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what is known, God gave them over to their sinful desires, to sexual impurity. They exchanged their bodies for a lie. Men lay with men, women with women, cats and dogs sleeping together. It was terrible. Ghostbusters. Furthermore, since they did not, verse 28, they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They're filled with every kind of wickedness, envy, depravity, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanders, God hates, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. Oh, my text reads, they went to Las Vegas. They disobey their parents. Terrible, terrible. They're senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They deserve death. And you sit there and you're going, Paul, you just said God made things right. And then you turned around and said God is pissed off. What is wrong with you? You ever tried to sort this out? You ever try to go, why does Paul move from this extraordinary statement about it's all about trust to you're going to burn? Why does he do that? You ever wondered? Now, here's the question I want to ask you. Let's say you have, you're going to write a book, and I've written a book beforehand, and my book is full of deception, manipulation, falsehood, but you want to write a book to counter this. Would you quote from my book in your book in order to show the falsity of my argument? Now, you know from your reading of Romans in chapters 2 and 3, Paul begins this whole rhetorical argument. Someone will say, bop, 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 and I bop. Others will say, this rhetorical argument about these others out there, these interlocutors, right? In a 1,000-page book, Doug Campbell has done what I think is the most masterful piece of work on this text. And what he argues is that Romans chapter 1, 18 to 32 is Paul quoting or summarizing. Now, this is important. Campbell took a lot of heat when he first came out with this book because he said Paul's using a Greek rhetorical practice known as prosopopoia. He's quoting another. But Campbell's later ameliorated that to say Paul is summarizing his Jewish Christian opponent. So if you want to know what it was that the Jewish Christian opponents of Paul were preaching, all you have to do is look at this text in Romans and the letter to the Galatians, where Paul, and Philippians chapter 3, where Paul is all over these opponents for what they're preaching. Part of what these Jewish Christian preachers are preaching, as you well know, is that in order to become a Christian, you first have to become a Jew. Now, who do Jews, not today and not all back then, but in a manner of speaking, who do Jews in Palestine hate and despise? Rome, right? Overlords, right? Now, they have a phrase, a catch-all phrase for anybody that's not Jewish, and it's Gentile. So, Gentiles need to become Jews before they can become Christians. That's the logic of Jewish Christianity. And when you look at Jewish Christian literature, you will soon find that because you're thinking in terms of temple and sacrifice, you're thinking in terms of clean and unclean, because you have to be clean to sacrifice. If you're unclean, you can't enter the temple and sacrifice. What makes a person unclean? Oh, well, we've got a list of all the things that can make a person unclean. And one of them's men dipping their Johnsons in holes they ought not to, and women doing things they ought not to. And that's part of our rule system. And so if you're going to do that, right, dancing, going to movies, drinking alcohol, whatever it is. We got all these rules down here. And in order to be part of our Christian community, you've got to get yourself circumcised, keep the Sabbath, have a kosher table, and follow these rules. And you will find, if you look at Romans 1, and you were to go to the Wisdom of Solomon. Do you know the book, The Wisdom of Solomon? Written in the first century, perhaps around the same time as Paul's writing his letters. You will find Romans 1:18 to 32. I believe it's around chapter 7 to 8. All of this phraseology about the standard Jewish hate rhetoric against the Gentiles. That's what it is. Standard Jewish hate rhetoric against the Gentiles. And Paul comes along, and the first words out of his mouth after he has summarized his opponent's viewpoint is, you who believe this have no excuse. You who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge the other, you're condemning yourself. And Paul will move on in chapter 2 and make a case that the Jewish Christians who are accusing the Gentiles of all this sin are, in fact, themselves the worst sinners. Now this text is not a clobber text anymore, is it? And in fact, Paul is the one that's on our side to show us how to argue against the clobber text. So Paul's the LGBTQ community's best friend. You with me on this? I think it's brilliant, this reading of Romans. Well, we know that Paul quotes his opponents. We go to the Corinthian letters. He's quoting the letter that was sent to him by the Corinthians with all their questions and things they're dealing with, and he quotes the letter, and he refutes it. And if we don't know that he's quoting that letter, if we're not paying attention, we're going to misread. So if we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, I want to show you something. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And why learning to read letters the way they were written in the ancient world is important. If we just come to the Bible as though it's God's word and we're going to read right off the page and get blessed and all that, I suppose you could do that. I really do. But when you came to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul has done his whole thing about tongues and what's really going on. And then he says, okay, we'll begin in verse 26. What shall we say then, brothers, when you come together? Everyone has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, and interpretation, and all of these must be done for the strengthening of the church. If anyone speaks in a tongue, 2, maybe 3 at most, should speak, one at a time, and someone should interpret. That is not the practice, by the way, the modern charismatics do. Everybody's babbling at once. If there's no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church, speak to himself and God. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. What is Paul saying? Engage in thinking in the church. Think this through. Discern it. If it's BS, name it as so. If it's from the Lord, listen to it. And if a revelation comes to someone who's sitting down, the first speaker should stop. You can all prophesy in turn, so everyone may be instructed. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the control of prophets, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. As in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. What? They're not allowed to speak. They must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. It's disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Look at this text. As in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. The first thing you have to do is go, okay, what kind of person says, well, in all the churches, we do this? What kind of person says that? Somebody that's trying to convince somebody else that they're doing it wrong because we all do it this way. And what is it that is being done wrong here? Women are speaking in the church. Oh, wait a second. So women shouldn't be allowed to speak in the church. Does Paul have women disciples? Do they lead house churches? Is one of them, Junia, called an apostle in Romans 16? Right? So you begin to go, in Galatians 3, Paul says there's no male or female. Is he saying here that in all the churches women are silent? Or is he quoting his interlocutors again? Or folks in Corinth who are wanting to go be Jewish Christian like Peter and James and saying, hey man, in the synagogues, women are over here, men are over here, and only the men talk. The women are silent in the synagogue. So it should be that way in the churches too. Women should just be silent. If they need to talk, let them talk at home. And Paul's going, you don't get it. Now watch how Paul handles this. If this is in fact, he's quoting the bad interpretation because he needs to refute it. Watch this. Notice also, they are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. Does Paul ever use the law this way? As the law says, follow the law, do the law, or is Paul a critic of the law? So we know this is not Paul. It can't be Paul. He doesn't even speak this way. So these people are going, women should be silent in the churches. And look at Paul's response. Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only people it has reached? If anybody thinks he's a prophet or spiritually gifted, let him acknowledge what I'm writing to you is the Lord's command. Ooh! Just took that one right off the table, didn't he? And just to show you how confusing this text is, in the manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, those verses about women, they're in different places. The early scribes couldn't quite figure this out either. But if Paul's quoting his opponents in the letters and refuting them, and we don't read them flat as though it's all Paul, now we can see this superhero of Christianity who sees the power of this gospel as pure love, pure grace, no economy of exchange, just a gift-giving character of this God against the religious God with all the codes and the rules and the do this and the do all that. And we can see Paul now in a clear light as one who really does get this business of the gospel. That's right. Thank you for that. Brothers and sisters. Thank you. He's addressing the sisters, isn't he? Good point. Oh, that's yours is being inclusive in the translation. What you have in Greek is probably adelphoi. I'll look it up. But adelphoi is a generic term for brothers and sisters. Adelphoi, adelphi, sisters, adelphoi, brothers. But you're not going to say in a letter adelphoi kai adelphi, brothers and sisters. They just didn't do that. They just used the term brothers as a catch-all. But the translators recognize it's a generic category, so they'll use brothers and sisters. Sure. So one of Campbell's arguments is that they had a postal service in the ancient world. I live in Corinth, and you're visiting me, and I know you're on your way over to Ephesus, and I hand you a letter, and I say, would you mind dropping this off at Billy Bob's house on such and such road? And you would take that letter and deliver it. That's how letters were delivered, and you could also leave them with a ship's captain and these kinds of things. The expensive way to deliver a letter is to send it with somebody. Then you got to pay carriage fees on the ships or the roads. You got to feed them, these kinds of things. That's the expensive way to send a letter. Paul always sent his letters first class with a person, because Paul needed someone that could interpret that letter to the congregation. He sends his letters with people that he's had face-to-face contact with and explained to them, this is how I want you to read this. This is what's going on. They understood. And so when they would read these letters, they were a dramatic performance. And what they would do when they know the texts where Paul is either quoting from something or there's an interlocutor that he's going to critique, they shift voices. So if it's Paul, it might be something like, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the wrath of God is coming upon the unjust. And you see the shift in character, and then you go back to Paul. And then when you do Romans 2 and 3 this way, you've got Paul going, who are you, O men, to judge? But the law says, yes, but the law, yes, but God's. And you see the way evangelicals deal with you all through Romans 2 and 3. I mean, it's just like, dear God, help us, This is why Paul sent readers with his letters. They interpreted Paul to the congregations. We don't have those readers with us anymore. We're 2,000 years removed, and it's really, frankly, only been in the last 100 years that we've even thought about putting Paul's letters back into a Greco-Roman context, and that work has really only been done since the 1970s. It's brand new. There's so much new research and work out there right now. Like I told you, the church is 150 years behind the seminary. And I'm not talking the conservative Bible colleges. I'm talking the hard-working intellectual university profs and seminary peoples. 150 years behind. It will take the church that long to finally get to this kind of a reading, and we'll be so far beyond that in 150 years it won't be funny. That's why Christianity is so damned irrelevant. It's just so far behind. And it goes, oh, we don't want to be with the world. We don't go the way of the world. And I'm going, you are so worldly in your sacred violence, your justification of violence, your Janus face God. You are pure worldly going all the way back to the dawn of time. Your fear is that the future will bring you to the true and living God, the loving, merciful, compassionate deity. That's your real fear. And that is, in fact, the fear of every evangelical who, when you say to them, well, if you believe in universalism, then why should I believe? Why can't I just do whatever I want? You ever heard this? And what they're really saying is, I only believe because I'm afraid. That's all they're saying. And if fear is your motivation for faith, it's not faith. That's right. Yep.
Life is so much better. That's what I'm talking about, having heaven on earth.
Mm-hmm.
If you're living in harmony with our Creator.
Right. Right.
Love and all this business, life is just so much better. And giving forgiveness. Our bodies are made to disrupt and get sick when we're
Emotional distress and these things. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, there's a thing you said in that was quite lovely, and I'm going to capitalize on. So you're discussing this whole reality of let's just use the language being in tune with the Father. Let's just use that language for a moment. Now, is there anything you said to me just now or to us just now that an evangelical or fundamentalist preacher could not affirm? And the answer is everything you said they could affirm. They are going to hear, we have the love of God, we live in they're going to hear all that selectively. What they're going to do is they're going to hear all that through a sacrificial lens. Okay? That's what they're going to hear. They're not going to hear that you're coming from a critique of religion. They're just, okay? Now, that's, again, because their God requires sacrifice. So, like Paul and the writer of John, we have to find a way to articulate this real love, this authentic tuning in, this path of discipleship, apart from sacrifice. That is our challenge. That's the challenge going forward for the church. I mean, you as a pastor, you can do the church thing, the sound and fury, signifying nothing, and just be another church that looks like every other church. Or you can end up just saying, I am just going to follow this gospel out and see what it brings. Normally, you're not going to get a mega church preaching the gospel. Normally, it's going to be a small fellowship, because the fact is, Christians don't want to follow Jesus. They want to follow God. You go to church, you can hear God, 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 God. Jesus, Christians don't want to hear about Jesus. Non-Christians don't want to hear about Jesus, because Jesus is too specific. If you pay attention to Jesus, his path is so totally contrary and counterintuitive to everything we know from the Matrix. It just makes absolutely no sense. It really doesn't. Christians don't want to follow Jesus. They can't afford to. If they did, they'd lose their lives. The pastors can't afford to tell people to follow Jesus, because they'd lose their income.
Well, I think for me, and I thought about it a lot, and it's been a long road and stuff, but it's true. I'm still uncomfortable around the homeless and
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
guys that
Mm-hmm.
look like they've got 40 demons on.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
No, I'm still. But the fact is, I know that sometimes when I see a good-looking young man or an older whatever that I see on the street hungry, there's something sometimes hits me and I have to give it.
Yeah, sure, sure.
But others,
Yes,
it just doesn't.
that's right. I have the same thing. Do you have the same thing? Do you? The same thing. Sometimes the Spirit will say, do this, and you do it, and other times it won't, because we're not ever given a generic command to love the world. Let me explain this to you. This is the problem with liberal Christianity in a nutshell. Liberal Christianity says we're supposed to bring justice to every human being. We're supposed to make everything level with every human being, right? That's liberal progressive Christianity. Equality for all, no DOMA laws, no racism, we need to have Obamacare, we need to have everybody be paid the same, the Christian communist dialogue of the 60s and 70s really influenced progressive Christianity, and it's very Marxist in its orientation, Anyway, it's not necessarily a criticism. Marx wasn't all wrong. But here's the thing about liberal Christianity. It says we have to love the world. And in so doing, liberal Christianity gets out there, and it's often in its fringe movement, its anger, its rage, its bitterness, screaming and yelling against the white male establishment, or however it does, creating a whole new scapegoat. Just as the white male built modernity upon persons of color, persons of color are trying to build post-modernity on white males. That's what we're seeing right now. And the reaction to that is the election of Donald Trump. The white males have known they're being scapegoated for a while now, and they're reacting. It's terrible. It's just going to get vicious. So, back to loving the world. Jesus never commanded us to love the world. That's God's job. We're only commanded to love the neighbor. That's the one next to us. And so when you're listening, the Spirit's telling you who's the neighbor, right?